Indeed, good to be here back again, and good to see all of you also back again. We're wondering whether it's going to be the same turnout or we're going to have people who are not going to be coming back again, but it's good to see some faces that I saw the last week as well as some new faces. And thank you for having me over here, Reverend Rajiv. It's a pleasure and a privilege, and also thank you for the team for that beautiful time of worship that was really powerful. And thank you, Reverend Rajiv, for your kind words of introduction. If you were here last week, I usually don't remember the sermon of last week, but let me try your memory out. Can you remember the 4 points that we were looking at last week? Anyone? We looked at 4 A's. Not the, A-level results, but we looked at 4 A's. Okay, let me not put you to embarrassment. We looked at an attitude of availability that Joseph had when he was in prison, in that context of confinement. We looked at his attention to his surroundings. He was not self-absorbed, but he was open to what was going on around him. We looked at his announcement of truth courageously, being able to speak truth in that context, even though it might have been dangerous. And also an acceptance of delay. And we looked at the fact, and that's what we're going to be looking at, that delay is not a denial. So last week we were looking at Joseph in prison, and today we are looking at Joseph in the palace and serving in the palace, in the position of power. The story is told of a young man who was newly promoted to be a manager in a corporate company, and he was given his new office, and on the first day of work he goes into his office and he looks around him and he's quite pleased with his desk and all of the equipment that he's been given. And he's just settling himself down, and through the glass door, he sees someone coming towards his office and knocking on his door. And so he quickly sits down and grabs the phone into his hand and signals to the person to come in. And this man comes in and he says, sit down. And he talks into the phone and says, yes, Mr. Chairman, I'm sure I can handle this matter. Don't worry, I will go through the merger. I've done this thing before. You don't have to worry a thing. No, you don't need to be there. I will handle it, sir. $1 million, not a problem at all. That's quite fine. I'm surely able to deal with these buyers, and don't worry about that. We will work through everything. And he says, I will handle the matter and talk to you soon, sir. And he puts the phone down and he says, yes, what can I do for you? And the man says, sir, I'm from the logistics department. I just came to hitch up your phone connection. Sometimes we want to act powerful when we are in power or when we are given power. And what we are going to be looking at today is Joseph and how he handled power. And we are going to be looking at 4 things again. The first thing is that he was prepared in obscurity. The second thing is that he was positioned for stewardship. The third thing that we see is that power did not dilute his perspective. His perspective was undiluted. And finally, he provided for the common good. Some of us are either a thermometer or a thermostat. And the question I want to ask you is, which are you? What's the difference? A thermometer, those of you who are in the medical field, simply reflects its environment. If the room is cold, it will show itself as cold. If the room is hot or the person is hot and having fever, it will reflect that the person has fever. A thermostat, on the other hand, sets the temperature, regardless of the environment. So my question to you is, are you a thermometer or a thermostat? The thermometers change their character according to the circumstances. The thermostat sets the environment. Joseph, I believe, was a thermostat. Whether it was the cold prison or the warm and comfortable palace, the setting of his heart did not change. And that's what we see in that. Power does not change character, it reveals it. Joseph enters power and remains a servant. Let's look at the context of this passage. As we look at the context of this passage and we go back, we didn't do that in the reading, but you will notice that the passage in chapter 41 and verse 1 says 2 years had gone by. We stopped last time with Joseph telling the baker, please remember me. For 2 years, the baker forgot Joseph. For 2 years, he was there. And it also says, when you look at verse 14, when Pharaoh sent for Joseph, look at where he was brought from. He was quickly brought from the dungeon, it says. He was brought from the dungeon. So although in chapter 39, he was given in charge of the Pharaoh's officers by the prison captain, he didn't have a privileged position. He was still in the dungeon. In fact, he seemed to have been quite unkempt because verse 14 says he had to be shaved. His beard had probably grown over and he had to be shaved to be presentable to Pharaoh. And that was the context in which Pharaoh was. And as we look at chapter 41, God opens Pharaoh's dreams to Joseph. And again, once again, we see the same thing. When Joseph is brought before Pharaoh, he does not say, I will interpret it. Again, he says, God will interpret it. And then Pharaoh speaks fairly astonishing words in verse 39, where we began with our reading today, when he says, is there such a wise man as discerning as you? And Pharaoh gives authority to Joseph. Joseph is appointed the second in command of Egypt. He's in an empire that is not his home. He's second only to Pharaoh. It's not his people, not his covenant nation. Yet Joseph begins to serve Egypt just as much as it mattered to God. And the narrative here shows Joseph's administration, his wisdom, his political savvy, his theological humility, and his closeness to God. Genesis 41 is not just a story of Joseph's promotion. It's a story of a godly man serving faithfully when power is entrusted. This sermon is not about success and how we handle success, but it's about stewardship. So the first thing that we see in this story, and as we are looking at this passage from 39 to 41 of chapter 41, we see that he was prepared in obscurity. The prison would be a school where Joseph would learn to wait on God. For 2 years, he waited. No word, no hope. I remember there was a chaplain in school. Those of you who went to St. Thomas's College may remember him, Reverend L.J.B. Fernando. We had another name that we called him by, but he was Reverend L.J.B. Fernando. And he on one chapel service made a particular line that has stuck in my mind. Maybe it's a line he picked up from somewhere, maybe you would have heard it yourself sometimes. But he repeated it so many times during that sermon that it didn't leave me thereafter. And he said, disappointments are his appointments. Disappointments are his appointments. Joseph's time in the prison was not accidental. He moved from the prison to the palace in a single day. That was how quick his ascension to power was, but his heart did not change. The environment shifts, the authority expands, the visibility increases, but Joseph's heart remains a servant. Every role that Joseph held before had trained him. He was a son in Jacob's household. He was a slave in Potiphar's house. He was an administrator in prison. It was not the palace that shaped Joseph. God had already done that. Joseph's years in Potiphar's house and in prison were not wasted. They prepared him. And by the time Pharaoh needed an interpreter and an administrator, Joseph was ready. And that was why Pharaoh was able to say, "Can we find anyone like this man in whom is the Spirit of God?" Can we find anyone like this man in whom is the Spirit of God? Pharaoh, an Egyptian, was able to identify in Joseph a quality that he himself did not possess. Last week I quoted from Mandela in the book From the Long Walk, in which he says, we go to prison first and then become president. We go to prison first and then become president. And that is what we see in Joseph's life. Joseph's preparation teaches us this truth. God never wastes obscure seasons. God never wastes obscure seasons. If you're feeling right now that you're in a season of obscurity, in a season of silence, when nobody is able to see you, remember that God does not waste it. A modern day example is Abraham Lincoln. Remembered as one of the greatest presidents in the American history. Unfortunately, we do not have such like that now. And as we look at his life before his presidency, he lost multiple elections. He failed in business. He was mocked publicly. At one point he wrote, he felt that the melancholy of his life was dragging him down. Yet those years of failure shaped him. When finally the nation needed a leader, Abraham Lincoln was ready. God does not waste obscure seasons. Preparation comes long before promotion. If you're feeling set aside, realize that it is a season of preparation. Ask yourself the question, if you're in the midst of that, ask yourself, what is God forming in you right now? What is it that He wants you to become? What kind of person does He want me to be able to handle authority? And so Joseph is prepared in obscurity, and then he's positioned for stewardship. As we look at verses 42 to 45, he's promoted with an authority and position for stewardship. Joseph receives a ring, robes, and authority. But there's no indication that Joseph ever became proud. Authority, when it is talked about in Scripture, is never ownership, but it's always entrustment, it is stewardship. Joseph understands that power is a trust, not a trophy. Authority is not a possession, it is permission under God. It is God allowing us to serve. When Joseph implements his storage plan, from verses 46 to 49, he demonstrates system thinking, integrity in taxation, care for those in need. He gathers grain like the sand of the sea, it says. To me, this is faith expressed in spreadsheets. This is worship through systems. I'm known to be a systems person. People get a little tired of me sometimes because of that. I've looked at this passage from Genesis 41 in the context of the work that I've been doing for many years. And I believe Joseph was the first humanitarian DRR expert or disaster risk reduction expert. And as you study this passage, you see the principles. If any of you are in the humanitarian sector, you will know the language I'm talking about. You see all of the DRR principles within this whole chapter. Long before the UN began to put in DRR principles, you see Joseph beginning to use that. Pharaoh entrusts to him the nation. Where are you in your authority? Are you on a church committee? Are you handling budgets? Are you running a family business or running a business for somebody else? Are you a teacher in a classroom? Are you a civil servant, a government servant? The question is not how much authority I have. The question is, how faithfully am I stewarding that authority that has been given to me? Joseph was prepared in obscurity, positioned for stewardship. And now in the next point, we see something deeply personal, something revealing about his inner theology. How will Joseph handle his promotion personally? Promotion not only tests our competence. You might have heard of the Pareto principle, someone rises up to the extent of their incompetence, because beyond that you cannot rise up. And promotion tests our competence. Here, promotion tests our baggage, our emotional baggage. How we posture and deal with pain, the pain of our past, in the power of our position, is what we see in Joseph's story. Will Joseph remember the pain? Will he remember the promises? Will he remember God? And so just as he was prepared in obscurity, positioned for stewardship, we see thirdly that his perspective was undiluted in prosperity. In verse 50, there is a pause. A pause almost similar to what we saw at the end of chapter 40, verse 23, when it says he was forgotten. Verse 50 says, before the famine begins, and draws our attention to something else. Before the crisis unfolds, before Joseph's skills in crisis management are put to the test, before his disaster mitigation and preparedness plans are put into action, something happens. The author of Genesis records something intimate. He records the birth of Joseph's sons and their naming. In the ancient Near East, naming was something very special. It had a meaning to it. I know some of us want to name our children after biblical names. But the tradition has it that you name someone with the hope of what we have. I remember when our son was born, we were just beginning the work at Carl Lillier, which was a new vision for the Methodist Church. We opened the college in the January of that year, and on February he was born. And so we named him Navnet, which means new vision, and Randev, which means treasure of God. And in the tradition of the ancient Near East, that is what happens. It says in verses 50 to 52, before the year of famines came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar's priest, bore them to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. The name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Amongst the Jews and the ancient Near East, this was a very significant thing, because the name embodied a person's essence, character, and what they hoped for. Names were not just identifiers, but they reflected some character. There was an association to God as well, often in those names. And also, if you look at scripture, biblical accounts indicate that it was the mothers or the midwives who named their children. It was a maternal role. Eve, Genesis says, named Cain and Abel. Rebekah named Jacob and Esau. Pharaoh's daughter named Moses. And some traditions say she asked the midwives, and they gave the name Moses. And here it says Joseph names them. The father names them. And he names them after God's faithfulness. The tradition had it that you name them after some gods, and he had been in Egypt for so long. He did not name them after some Egyptian god. He did not name them after Pharaoh, who appointed him out of gratitude for Pharaoh. But he names his sons with theology. Manasseh, God has made me forget. The bitterness of his hardship. Joseph had been betrayed, sold, falsely accused, imprisoned, forgotten. Remember what he said in chapter 40? He told the baker, remember me. And now in chapter 41, he's naming his son Manasseh, and he says, God has made me forget. Interesting contrast. Every time Manasseh walked through the door, it reminded Joseph to forget. Every time Manasseh walked through the door, it reminded Joseph to forget. Promotion was not something that made him forget his God. Pharaoh did not heal him, power did not heal him, God healed him of that pain. And then at least 9 months later, because there was almost 6 years before the famine began. And in that time, we do not know at which point Manasseh and Ephraim were born. But 9 months after Manasseh, obviously at least, his second son was born. And notice that line. He has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Egypt was not his home. You know, like that Jim Reeves song, this world is not my home, I'm just a passing through. Joseph understood. Joseph's theology was profound. A few days ago, some of us were reflecting on this whole thing of the wilderness. And as I was reading this passage again, that came to mind, that we are called to prepare the way in the wilderness. We serve in the wilderness. We serve in the midst of affliction. It's not out of it. The song we just sang a few minutes ago in our worship, Matt Redmond's "Blessed Be Your Name," is based on Job's saying, "Naked I come, and naked I will return." Joseph's affliction was his intense years of suffering. He contrasts the fruitfulness with the affliction, the land of plenty with the land of wilderness. Once again, Joseph's character is revealed. Joseph has not become hardened. He has not become resentful. He has not become self-glorifying. He has become grateful. His prosperity did not lead to independence, but to God dependence. He still says, God has made me forget. God has made me fruitful, not once, but twice. Last week we ended on that note that delay was not denial. And today we see that perspective once again. God has made me forget. An exercise of emotional and spiritual discipline. I think we all know that famous hymn, "It is Well With My Soul," sung by or written by Horatius Spafford, who lost his 4 daughters in a shipwreck. His wife survived and sent him, saved alone. And when he crossed that ocean to meet her, he wrote the words of that song, it is well with my soul. Horatius Spafford did not deny his affliction. He declared fruitfulness in the affliction, and Joseph does the same. Where am I in my journey of healing? With whatever baggage I might have with my past, in my family, whatever painful experiences that I have gone through, am I able to say, God has made me forget? Have I truly healed, or have I simply advanced? Have I been able to forgive? Forget the past, not in the sense of erasing it, but not allowing it to impact on your present. Or have I simply succeeded? Has prosperity made me proud or grateful? Joseph named his blessings with theology. If your success disappears tomorrow, would God still be enough? Would God still be enough? Joseph showed that stewardship, that perspective. Just as he was prepared, just as he was positioned, just as his perspective was undiluted, we now see him providing for the common good. Joseph did not go thinking, what we hear so often, an entitlement theology that says, I have suffered so much. I have gone through so much. God has blessed me now. And now it's my chance to enjoy some of the fruit. He did not use his past or his pain to justify personal profit. Lee Kuan Yew, when he became the founding Prime Minister of Singapore, the nation was poor, vulnerable, and uncertain. Instead of choosing short-term popularity, Lee focused on long-term planning. He prioritized food security, similar to what Joseph did, infrastructure, education, governance systems that would benefit generations to come. And still, nations like us, who looked upon us and thought that we had progressed, are still behind them and looking to them now. When famine comes, Joseph opens the storehouses. Here was a man who does not hoard but distributes. He works for the flourishing of a nation that once imprisoned him. He follows through with the calling of Abraham when God said, "Come, and I will bless you to be a blessing to the nations. He understood that he was blessed to bless. Joseph models what Jeremiah says later when the Jews were in exile: seek the peace and the prosperity of the city, for if it prospers, you too will prosper. Jeremiah 29 and verse 7. Joseph's service benefits not just the Egyptians. First, he takes that oath to Pharaoh, submits to Pharaoh, lives in the palace, and acts as a steward. But he did not exploit that office for narrow gain. Joseph works for the well-being of everybody. Cross boundaries, cross nations, faithful stewardship serves the community. When we are given authority, when we are given power, when we are given position, how do we serve? Does my work bless others, or does it just bless myself? In our leadership, in our decision making, as a church maybe even, do we decide to benefit our own selves, our own tribe, our own congregation, or are we willing to look beyond ourselves? When promotion comes, there is something that is associated with it. I have two stones in this jar. One is called privilege, and one is called responsibility. What do you think gets heavier when you get promoted? What do you think gets heavier when you get promoted? Do you feel the weight of privilege, or do you feel the weight of responsibility? Joseph felt the weight of responsibility. Joseph shows us that promotion reveals character, stewardship proves faithfulness, and service glorifies God. Viktor Frankl, a Jewish psychiatrist, when he was incarcerated in a Nazi concentration camp in Auschwitz, he lost his parents, he lost his wife, he lost his manuscripts, his life work. He was stripped of fame, status, profession, and dignity. And then while he was there, he wrote a book, Man's Search for Meaning. And he did a study in prison. And in that study he said, everything can be taken from a man but one thing: human freedom and hope. Human freedom and hope. And Frankl began to encourage those fellow prisoners. He could not control his confinement like Joseph could not, but he chose to contribute in his confinement. He served in chains. Joseph, from handcuffs to a signet ring, from chains, metal chains, to a golden chain that was placed upon him. The uniform of prison garb changed, but Joseph's character did not change. His heart did not. Where are we? Are we faithful where God has placed us? Whatever our position of power might be, whatever our season might be, you might be still feeling left aside and set aside. Do you see that as preparation? Do you see where you are as a position for stewardship? Despite the circumstances, are you able to be like a thermostat and allow your perspective to be undiluted? Are you willing to provide for the common good, to bless because you've been blessed? Is that the calling that we have? We close with this quote. Abraham Lincoln said, Nearly all men, next one, can stand adversity. But if you want to test a man's character, give him power. And when you receive that power, may I encourage you once again and remind you once again of the words that we closed with last time. SDG. Sign off, not with your initials, but sign off SDG, Soli Deo Gloria. Johann Sebastian Bach, the greatest composer, never signed his name off on his scores, but always signed it off as SDG. When we do our work, when we do our ministries, when we do our service, is that the attitude we have? That was the attitude with which Joseph served. Whether in the prison, whether in the palace, whatever the circumstances, his heart did not change. His acknowledgement of God, his acknowledgement of his role in the kingdom of God as a channel of blessing, not as a bowl to receive, but as a channel to give others. That is the calling that we have as we look at the life of Joseph. And as we sing our closing hymn today, "Here I am, Lord," the words of that say that the Lord is seeking, the Lord of sea and sky. He has heard his people cry, "Who dwell in dark and sin, my hand will save. I have made the stars of night, I will make their darkness bright. Who will bear my light to them? Whom shall I send?" And the refrain says, "Here I am, Lord." And as each verse describes the different contexts to which God calls us, are we willing, like Joseph, to say, whatever the context, be it the prison or the palace, "Here I am, Lord. Is it I, Lord? I have heard you calling in the night. In the obscurity of our preparation, even in that darkness, I will go, Lord. If you lead me, I will hold your people in my heart." Blessing to bless others. Shall we rise and sing this song?